Arizona Territory, 1878. The dust cloud approached slowly from the eastern horizon, catching the late afternoon sun in a golden haze. William Jameson squinted against the glare, his weathered hand shading his eyes as he watched the lone rider approach his ranch. Behind him, the newly constructed two-story house stood as testament to his success, white-painted clapboard gleaming against the backdrop of red desert and distant mountains. "Pa, who is it?" Lindsay Jameson stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. At 22, she possessed a quiet strength that matched her father's, though her features held the delicate beauty of her late mother. "Can't rightly tell," William replied, his voice carrying the gravel of years spent shouting orders across windswept plains. "But he's riding steady, not a drifter." As the figure drew closer, William's posture stiffened. The rider sat tall on a paint horse that moved with remarkable grace despite the punishing heat. His long black hair was tied back with a strip of leather, his copper skin marking him clearly as Native American. "Apache," William muttered, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle that was never far from reach. Even now, when treaties had been signed and the bloodiest days of conflict were supposedly behind them. The rider approached at an unhurried pace, stopping a respectful distance from the house. Up close, his face revealed itself, strong-boned and handsome, with eyes that held wisdom beyond his apparent years, which William guessed to be around 30. "My name is Tyee," he announced in perfect, unaccented English. "I come seeking work." William's eyebrows rose slightly. "Work? I break horses, tend cattle, build fences." Each statement was delivered with quiet certainty. "I worked 2 seasons for John Mackenzie at Crescent Valley Ranch, 1 year with the Hendersons near Tucson." Lindsay watched from the porch, transfixed. Unlike most of the settlers who had grown up fearing and hating the Apache, she had been educated in Boston until her mother's death called her back to the territory 3 years ago. Her mind held fewer prejudices, though the stories of raids and violence had reached even her sheltered ears. William's skepticism showed plainly on his face. "And why would Mackenzie hire an Apache?" "Because no one else could break his stallion," Tyee replied simply. He reached into a small pouch at his waist and withdrew a folded piece of paper, which he extended toward William. His words, not mine. William hesitated before taking the letter. As he unfolded and read it, his expression shifted from suspicion to surprise. "Says here you have a way with animals, unlike anything he's ever seen," William said, looking up from the paper. "Says you saved his herd during the drought last year." Tyee offered no confirmation or denial, merely waiting with the patience of a man accustomed to being judged. William Jameson was no fool. Good help was scarce in the territory, with many men chasing gold or silver dreams. His ranch was growing faster than he could manage with the 3 hands he currently employed. "I'll give you a week's trial," he finally said. "You'll bunk with the other hands. First sign of trouble, you're gone." "Fair terms," Tyee nodded once. Lindsay watched as her father led the Apache toward the bunkhouse. Her curiosity piqued in a way she hadn't felt since returning from the East. There was something in the man's bearing, a dignity that refused to bend, despite the obvious contempt he must have faced wherever he went in white settlements. That evening at supper, the other ranch hands ate quickly and with minimal conversation, casting occasional suspicious glances toward the bunkhouse where the Apache had taken his meal alone. "You sure about this, Mr. Jameson?" asked Hank, the oldest of the hands, who had been with William since before Lindsay was born. "Apache ain't like other Indians. He comes with references," William cut him off, "and we need the help with the new horses coming next week. That's all there is to it." Lindsay said nothing, but her thoughts drifted to the quiet stranger and the life that had brought him to their door, seeking work among those who had driven his people from their ancestral lands. What kind of courage did that require? What kind of necessity drove it? Dawn broke across the ranch with ribbons of crimson and gold painting the sky. Lindsay rose early, as was her custom, to help prepare breakfast before the day's work began. From the kitchen window she caught sight of a figure moving among the corral, where they kept their most troublesome horse, a magnificent black stallion that had thrown every man who attempted to ride him. She stepped onto the porch, coffee mug in hand, and watched in astonishment as Tyee stood in the center of the corral, the stallion circling him at a trot. No rope bound the animal, no bridle controlled its movements, yet something invisible connected man and beast. Tyee's lips moved, though she was too far away to hear his words. His hands remained at his sides, palms open. The stallion snorted, tossed its head, then gradually slowed its pace. After what seemed an eternity, the horse approached Tyee, nostrils flaring as it caught his scent. Then, impossibly, the stallion lowered its proud head and allowed Tyee to place a hand against its muzzle. "Sweet heaven," she whispered. "Never seen anything like it." Her father's voice came from behind her, causing her to start slightly. William had also risen early and now stood watching the scene with undisguised amazement. "That horse nearly killed Hank last month." Over the next days, the pattern continued. Tyee worked from sunrise until well past dusk, taking on the most difficult tasks without complaint. The animals responded to him as if he possessed some secret language understood only by creatures untamed by civilization. Even the ranch dogs, normally suspicious of strangers, followed him adoringly. The other hands maintained their distance at first, eating separately and speaking to Tyee only when necessary, but as the days stretched into weeks, even the most skeptical among them couldn't deny his value to the ranch. Lindsay found herself creating reasons to observe his work, bringing water to the men in the fields, checking on the progress of the new foals, gathering eggs from the henhouse near where Tyee repaired fencing. Each encounter left her more intrigued by the silent strength he carried. One evening, as sunset painted the western sky in shades of fire, Lindsay discovered Tyee sitting alone on a fallen log near the creek that ran along the eastern property line. In his hands, he carved something from a piece of wood, his knife moving with the same fluid precision he brought to every task. She hesitated, knowing that propriety dictated she should turn back to the house. Unmarried women did not seek out the company of men, especially not men from cultures as different as theirs, but something about his solitude called to her. "May I join you?" she asked, stepping forward. Tyee looked up, surprise flickering briefly across his normally composed features. After a moment he nodded and moved slightly to make room on the log. Lindsay sat, smoothing her skirts beneath her. For several minutes they shared the silence, watching as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared. "What are you making?" she finally asked, nodding toward the carving in his hands. Tyee held it up, the emerging form of a horse, its lines capturing the very essence of movement and power. "It's beautiful," she said truthfully. "Beauty is everywhere," he replied, his deep voice soft against the background chorus of night insects. "Most people no longer see it." "I see it," Lindsay said, her eyes meeting his before quickly looking away. "I missed this land terribly when I was away at school. The emptiness that isn't empty at all, the silence that's filled with voices, if you listen closely enough." Tyee studied her with newfound interest. "You understand what many of your people never learn." "My mother taught me to look beyond what others see," Lindsay explained. "Before she died, she would take me riding at dawn, just to watch the light change over the mountains." They fell silent again, but it was a comfortable silence. Two souls recognizing something familiar in each other, despite the vast differences in their lives. "Why did you come here?" Lindsay finally asked. "To work among those who—" She trailed off, unsure how to phrase the difficult truth of what white settlers had done to his people. "Among those who took our land?" Tyee finished for her, without bitterness. "The world changes, Lindsay Jameson. My people can change with it, or they can disappear. I choose to find a way forward, even if that way means working for my father. Your father is an honest man. He judges by actions, not just by birth." Tyee's hands resumed their careful carving. "That is rare." A shout from the direction of the house broke the moment, her father calling her name. "I should go," Lindsay said, rising reluctantly. "Thank you for sharing your evening with me." Tyee nodded, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer than was proper. As she turned to leave, he spoke again. "The carving is for you," he said, holding out the nearly completed wooden horse, "for someone who sees beauty." Lindsay hesitated, knowing she should refuse the gift. Such exchanges created expectations, crossed boundaries that shouldn't be crossed, but her hand reached out of its own accord, fingers brushing his as she accepted the carving. "Thank you," she whispered, then hurried back toward the calling voice. The wooden horse clutched against her heart like a talisman. Neither of them noticed Hank standing in the shadows of a cottonwood tree, his weathered face hardening as he watched the exchange. Summer stretched into autumn, bringing cooler nights and the promise of winter to come. The ranch prospered under William Jameson's steady hand, with Tyee's presence proving to be more valuable than anyone could have anticipated. The new horses were broken and trained in half the expected time. The cattle grew fat on rangeland that Tyee had identified when others thought the grass too sparse. Lindsay found herself drawn to the Apache's quiet wisdom, creating increasingly frequent opportunities for conversation. Their exchanges, always proper and often within sight of others, nonetheless grew more personal as trust developed between them. She learned that Tyee was the son of a chief, educated by missionaries before returning to his people. He spoke 3 languages fluently and could read the stars as easily as she read books. He had lost his wife and infant son to smallpox 5 years earlier, a tragedy that had sent him seeking a new path away from the reservations where disease spread like wildfire. In turn, she shared stories of her mother, of her years in Boston, of her love for the wild beauty of the territory that so many Easterners viewed as savage and uncivilized. He listened with a depth of attention she had never experienced, as if each word she spoke was precious. William Jameson observed their growing friendship with mixed emotions. He recognized his daughter's loneliness since returning from the East, where she had enjoyed the company of other educated young women. Here in the territory, suitable companions were few, and he couldn't deny that Tyee's character had proven impeccable, his work ethic unmatched, his integrity evident in every action. But he also understood the realities of their world. Apache and white simply didn't mix, not in marriage, not in the eyes of the community that sustained his business and would eventually determine his daughter's future. "Lindsay," he said one evening as they sat on the porch after supper, "I've been thinking it might be time to consider a trip to Tucson. The Prestons have invited you to stay with them for the harvest season." Lindsay looked up from her embroidery, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "The Prestons, why would I go now? We have so much work here before winter." William cleared his throat. "Robert Preston's son, Thomas, has returned from law school in St. Louis. He's joined his father's practice. A fine young man with excellent prospects." Understanding dawned in Lindsay's eyes. "So this is about finding me a husband." "It's about your future," William replied gently. "You're a young woman of quality and education. You deserve a life that matches your upbringing. And if I'm content with the life I have here," William sighed, setting aside his pipe, "Lindsay, I've seen how you look at him." Her cheeks flushed, but she held her father's gaze. "I don't know what you mean." "The Apache, Tyee. He's a good worker and I respect his skills. But there are boundaries in this world that can't be crossed, not without consequences that would destroy you both." Lindsay's hands trembled slightly as she resumed her stitching. "We're friends, nothing more. He's teaching me about the land, the plants, the animals, things I never learned in Boston." "See that it remains that way," William said, his tone softening. "Not for my sake, but for yours. This territory isn't ready for—" He trailed off, unwilling to give voice to the unthinkable. Lindsay remained silent, her eyes fixed on her needlework, though her thoughts were far away, remembering the warmth in Tyee's gaze when he'd shown her how to use certain plants for medicine, the gentle correction of his hands when he'd taught her to approach a nervous foal. Just friendship, she told herself, but her heart knew the lie. The following day brought dark clouds and the promise of the season's first significant rainfall. The ranch hands hurried to complete outdoor tasks before the weather turned. Lindsay, returning from collecting eggs, saw Tyee leading the troublesome black stallion, now remarkably obedient, toward the barn. A crack of thunder split the air, and the stallion reared in sudden panic. Tyee kept his grip on the lead rope, speaking softly to calm the frightened animal. As Lindsay watched, another ranch hand, Thomas, a new hire, approached from the opposite direction, carrying a saddle. The stallion's nostrils flared at the scent of the leather, its fear escalating. Tyee signaled Thomas to stay back, but the young cowboy, eager to prove himself, continued forward. "I'll help you get him inside," Thomas called. "No," Tyee's voice was firm. "The horse is afraid. Give him space." But Thomas, like many young men on the frontier, viewed caution as weakness. He moved closer, and the stallion exploded into motion, rearing high and striking out with its front hooves. Lindsay cried out as she saw Thomas fall beneath the horse's hooves. Without hesitation, Tyee threw himself between the panicked animal and the fallen man, using his body as a shield while maintaining his grip on the lead rope. The stallion's hoof caught Tyee's shoulder with sickening force. He staggered but didn't fall, continuing to speak to the horse in a mixture of English and Apache, his voice somehow remaining calm despite the pain that must have been coursing through him. Gradually, impossibly, the stallion settled. By the time William and the other hands arrived at the commotion, Tyee had the horse under control and was helping Thomas to his feet. "Are you injured?" William demanded, looking between the two men. Thomas shook his head, brushing dust from his clothes. "No, sir. If not for him—" He nodded toward Tyee with newfound respect. "And you?" William turned to Tyee, noticing how the Apache held his left arm stiffly against his side. "It's nothing," Tyee replied, though the tightness around his eyes betrayed the lie. "Lindsay," William called, "take Tyee to the house and see to that shoulder. Hank, get this horse settled and then help Thomas with the remaining chores." Lindsay led Tyee to the house, hyper-aware of the impropriety of bringing him into the family's private space, yet equally conscious of her father's direct instruction. Inside, she guided him to the kitchen, where the large table provided space to examine his injury. "You'll need to remove your shirt," she said, her voice professional as she gathered bandages and the bottle of whiskey kept for medicinal purposes. When he didn't immediately comply, she looked up to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Your shoulder," she prompted. "I need to see it." Slowly, Tyee unbuttoned his work shirt, wincing slightly as he slid it from his injured shoulder. Lindsay caught her breath at the sight of his bare torso, not from impropriety, but from the network of scars that traced across his copper skin. Some were clearly from battle, others from what appeared to be ritualistic markings. The newest injury was already darkening into what would become a massive bruise. The skin split where the horse's hoof had connected. "This will hurt," she warned, pouring whiskey onto a clean cloth. Tyee didn't flinch as she cleaned the wound, his eyes never leaving her face. The intimacy of the moment, her hands on his bare skin, the quietness of the kitchen broken only by the distant rumble of thunder, created a tension neither acknowledged. "Why did you do it?" she asked softly, as she began binding his shoulder with strips of clean linen. "Put yourself in danger for Thomas. He's been nothing but cold to you since he arrived." "A man's worth isn't measured by how he treats his friends," Tyee replied, "but by how he treats those who have shown him no kindness." Lindsay's hands stilled on his shoulder. "Is that an Apache saying?" A rare smile touched his lips. "No, it's mine." Their eyes met and held, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Lindsay became acutely aware of her hands against his skin, of the steady rhythm of his breathing, of how close they stood in the empty kitchen. "Tyee," she whispered, uncertain what she meant to say next. The kitchen door swung open as her father entered, followed by Hank. Both men stopped short at the tableau before them, Lindsay standing intimately close to the half-dressed Apache, her hands lingering on his bandaged shoulder. "I've finished," Lindsay said quickly, stepping back and gathering the medical supplies. "The wound isn't deep, but the bruising will be severe." William's expression remained neutral, though his eyes narrowed slightly. "Thank you, Lindsay. Tyee, you're relieved of heavy duties until that shoulder heals. You can help with the accounts and supply inventory." "That's women's work," Hank protested, his gaze hard as it moved between Tyee and Lindsay. "It's work that needs doing," William replied firmly, "and Tyee's education makes him better suited to figures than most of you." He turned to Lindsay. "You'll show him the ledgers tomorrow morning." That night, Lindsay lay awake, listening to the rain drumming against the roof, her thoughts in turmoil. The memory of Tyee's skin beneath her fingers, the depth in his dark eyes when they'd locked with hers, the strange sense of rightness she'd felt standing close to him, all of it frightened and exhilarated her in equal measure. She wasn't naive. She understood what her father had been trying to tell her on the porch. A proper white woman did not develop feelings for an Apache, no matter how exceptional he might be. Such relationships existed on the frontier, but they existed in shadows, bringing shame to the women who chose them. Yet something within her rebelled against these unwritten rules. What she felt for Tyee transcended the physical attraction that certainly existed between them. She recognized in him a kindred spirit, someone who saw the world with the same sense of wonder she did, who valued the same qualities of honor and truth. As autumn deepened, Tyee's shoulder healed, but William kept him working closely with Lindsay on the ranch's accounts and correspondence. Whether this was a test of their propriety or simply practical use of Tyee's skills remained unclear, but the arrangement created daily opportunities for conversation that deepened their connection. They discovered shared passions for literature, for the natural world, for questions about the stars and what might lie beyond them. Tyee taught Lindsay words in the Apache language, smiling at her attempts to reproduce the unfamiliar sounds. She shared her mother's books of poetry, watching his face as he absorbed the rhythms of Wordsworth and Keats. On a crisp November afternoon, with the account books temporarily set aside, Lindsay found herself describing her mother's final days. She loved this land fiercely, Lindsay said, gazing out the study window toward the distant mountains. Even as the illness took her strength, she would ask to be carried to the porch so she could watch the sunset. Her last words to me were about finding beauty in unlikely places. She turned to find Tyee watching her with an intensity that made her heart quicken. I think she would have understood. Understood what? He asked softly when she didn't continue. Lindsay took a steadying breath. How I've come to feel about you. The words hung in the air between them, impossible to retract. Tyee remained still, only his eyes revealing the tumult her confession had created. Lindsay, he finally said, her name like a prayer on his lips. What I feel for you. He stopped, shaking his head. It cannot be. Because you're Apache and I'm white? The defiance in her voice surprised even her. Because I would not bring you pain, he replied simply, and loving me would bring you nothing but suffering in this world. Shouldn't that be my choice to make? Tyee rose from his chair, moving to stand before her. With infinite gentleness, he raised his hand to her cheek, his fingers barely grazing her skin. It was the first time he had touched her outside the necessity of their work, and the contact sent warmth cascading through her. Some choices have consequences beyond what we can imagine, he said softly. The sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway caused them to step apart quickly. By the time William entered the study, they were seated appropriately on opposite sides of the desk, ledger books open between them. But something had changed. A line had been crossed, a truth acknowledged that could never be unspoken. The winter of 1878 settled over the Arizona Territory with unusual severity. Snow blanketed the normally arid landscape, transforming the ranch into a world of pristine white, broken only by the dark silhouettes of buildings and fences. The cattle huddled in protected ravines, surviving on the hay that had been stored in anticipation of such weather. Despite the brutal conditions, the Jameson ranch continued to prosper. William's foresight in preparations, combined with Tyee's deep knowledge of survival in harsh environments, protected their stock when neighboring ranches suffered losses. The forced proximity of the winter months, days spent largely indoors, evenings gathered around the fireplace, created a strange domestic rhythm. Tyee, now firmly established as William's right-hand man, took his evening meals with the family rather than in the bunkhouse with the other hands. His quiet dignity and intelligence had won William's genuine respect, if not his blessing for the feelings growing between Tyee and Lindsay. Those feelings, though never again openly acknowledged after their moment in the study, manifested in 1,000 small ways. The brush of fingers when passing documents, exchanged glances across the supper table, conversations that continued long after William had retired for the evening. They were careful, always proper, always aware of the boundaries they dared not cross, but their hearts had already made choices their minds knew to be impossible. As February gave way to March, the snow began to recede. With the thaw came visitors, the first the ranch had seen since before Christmas. Thomas Preston and his father Robert arrived one afternoon, ostensibly to discuss business with William, though the presence of Thomas's sister Catherine suggested other motives. Lindsay greeted them with appropriate hospitality, painfully aware of her father's transparent matchmaking. Thomas Preston was handsome in a conventional way, his law education evident in his precise speech and formal manners. He paid particular attention to Lindsay, complimenting her appearance and asking detailed questions about her time in Boston. Tyee, present for the business discussions due to his role in the ranch's management, watched the interaction with an impassive face that revealed nothing of his thoughts. Only Lindsay, who had learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression, recognized the shadow of pain in his eyes. That evening, a small dinner party was arranged. Catherine Preston played the piano in the parlor, while Thomas engaged Lindsay in conversation about literature and art. William and Robert discussed the territory's politics and the prospects for statehood. Tyee remained silent unless directly addressed, his usual quiet dignity taking on an edge of withdrawal that only Lindsay noticed. As the evening wore on, Thomas grew bolder in his attentions, moving to sit beside Lindsay on the small sofa and speaking in tones meant only for her ears. "You must find it terribly isolated here," he said, his voice sympathetic. "A woman of your refinement deserves the stimulation of proper society." "I find plenty to occupy my mind," Lindsay replied, her eyes briefly finding Tyee across the room before returning to Thomas. "The territory has its own kind of education to offer." Thomas followed her glance, his expression cooling slightly. "Yes, I suppose living among such diverse elements has its anthropological interest." He lowered his voice further. "Though I must say, my father was quite surprised to find an Apache sitting at your table. Is that common practice here?" The condescension in his tone sparked a flare of anger in Lindsay's chest. "Mr. Tyee is my father's most valued employee and advisor. His intelligence and character have earned him a place of respect in this household." Thomas raised an eyebrow at her passionate defense. "Of course," he said smoothly. "I meant no offense. It's simply unusual, even in these changing times." Before Lindsay could respond, William rose from his chair. "Thomas, I understand you've become quite the chess player during your time in St. Louis. Perhaps you'd like a game. Lindsay, why don't you and Catherine continue getting acquainted?" The evening eventually concluded with invitations extended for the Jamesons to visit Tucson in the spring, and pointed suggestions from both fathers about the advantages of connections between prominent families in the developing territory. After their guests departed, William lingered in the parlor where Lindsay was extinguishing the lamps. "Thomas seemed quite taken with you," he observed. Lindsay continued her task without responding. "He'll make an excellent match for someone," William continued. "Educated, from a good family with prospects that will only improve as the territory grows." "Then I hope he finds that someone," Lindsay finally replied, turning to face her father. "Because it won't be me." William sighed heavily. "Lindsay, I understand he may not inspire the kind of romantic notions young women dream about, but practical considerations—" "This isn't about romance versus practicality," Lindsay interrupted, a rare occurrence that showed her agitation. "It's about respect. Did you hear how he spoke about Tyee? As if he were some curiosity to be studied, rather than a man of dignity and worth. And is that all this is about? Your defense of Tyee's dignity?" William's voice was gentle but probing. Lindsay faltered under her father's knowing gaze. "I care for him," she admitted softly. "More than I should." William crossed the room to take her hands in his. "I know," he said simply. "I've watched it grow between you, despite my hopes that it wouldn't." "Are you angry?" she asked, searching his face. "Disappointed. Yes, concerned. Deeply. But angry, no." He squeezed her hands. "You have your mother's heart, stubborn and true. But Lindsay, this world isn't kind to those who defy its expectations, especially not to women who choose men like Tyee, no matter how exceptional he may be. So I should marry someone like Thomas Preston instead, someone who looks down on people he doesn't understand, who values status above character." "You should consider all aspects of what a life with Tyee would mean," William replied. "The friends you would lose, the doors that would close, the children you might have belonging fully to neither world." He released her hands. "I won't force your choice. You're too much your mother's daughter for that to work anyway. But I ask you to think beyond today, beyond the feelings that seem so clear and powerful now." Lindsay nodded, unable to argue with the truth in her father's words, yet equally unable to imagine directing her heart elsewhere. The next morning dawned clear and unseasonably warm. Lindsay rose early, her conversation with her father having left her restless and in need of the peace she always found outdoors. She saddled her mare and rode toward the creek, now swollen with snowmelt. She found Tyee there, as if her thoughts had summoned him. He stood at the water's edge, watching the rushing current with the stillness of a man at prayer. "Tyee," she called softly, dismounting and securing her horse to a nearby tree. He turned, unsurprised by her presence. "I knew you would come," he said simply. "How?" "Your heart speaks to mine," he replied, the plain truth of his words more powerful than any poetic declaration could have been. Lindsay moved to stand beside him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body yet not touching. For several minutes they watched the water together, each gathering courage for words that needed saying. "Thomas Preston will ask for your hand," Tyee finally said, his voice steady despite the pain evident in his eyes. "Your father will give his blessing." "My father will give his blessing to the man I choose," Lindsay replied. "And I have made my choice." Tyee turned to face her fully, studying her with an intensity that seemed to reach into her very soul. "Do you understand what you're saying? What it would mean?" "I understand that some things are worth any price," she said. "That what I feel for you isn't something I can set aside for convenience or convention." "And what do you feel?" he asked, the question barely audible above the rushing water. Lindsay took a step closer, eliminating the careful distance they had maintained for so many months. "I love you," she said simply, "with a certainty I've never felt about anything else in my life." Tyee closed his eyes briefly, as if absorbing a physical blow. When he opened them again, they held a mixture of joy and sorrow that caught at Lindsay's heart. "And I love you," he replied, "since the moment you sat beside me on that fallen log and spoke of seeing the beauty others miss." His hand rose to cup her cheek, his touch feather-light. "But loving someone means wanting what's best for them, even when that isn't yourself." "Don't," Lindsay whispered, covering his hand with her own, pressing it more firmly against her skin. "Don't tell me that loving you isn't what's best for me. That's not your decision to make." "No," he agreed, "but it is mine to decide whether I can bear watching you lose everything for my sake." Before she could respond, he lowered his head and brushed his lips against hers, the barest touch gentle as a whisper, yet it sent fire coursing through her veins. When he started to pull away, Lindsay's hands moved to the back of his neck, drawing him back to her. Their second kiss deepened, years of restrained feelings finding expression in the meeting of lips and the mingling of breath. Tyee's arms encircled her waist, pulling her against him as if he could somehow merge their separate selves into one being. When they finally parted, both breathless, Tyee rested his forehead against hers. "This changes everything," he murmured. "Everything was already changed," she replied. "We just finally admitted it." The sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the moment. They separated quickly, turning toward the sound as 3 riders appeared. Hank, accompanied by 2 men Lindsay didn't recognize. Hank's face darkened with fury at the scene before him. "I knew it," he spat. "I told them all what was happening, but they wouldn't believe an Apache would dare." The strangers dismounted, their hands hovering near their holstered pistols. One wore a badge identifying him as a territorial deputy. "This the one?" the deputy asked Hank. "That's him," Hank confirmed. "Caught him in the act, just like I said." "In the act of what?" Lindsay demanded, stepping forward despite Tyee's restraining hand on her arm. The deputy ignored her, addressing Tyee directly. "You're wanted for questioning about a stage robbery near Tucson last month. Witnesses described an Indian matching your description." "That's ridiculous," Lindsay protested. "Tyee hasn't left the ranch in months." "Miss, with respect, you need to step aside," the deputy said, his tone making it clear he didn't believe the encounter he'd interrupted was consensual. "This man is coming with us." Tyee's posture shifted subtly, his body language communicating calm compliance rather than resistance. "I will go with you," he said to the deputy. "There's been a misunderstanding." "Tyee, no," Lindsay began, but he silenced her with a look. "Tell your father I've gone to clear up a mistake," he said, his eyes conveying a deeper message she couldn't fully decipher. "Everything will be resolved." As the men led Tyee away, Lindsay turned on Hank, her voice shaking with rage. "You know he's innocent. You know he's been here the entire time." Hank's weathered face showed no remorse. "What I know is that no Apache is going to soil a white woman while I have breath in my body." He spat on the ground. "Your father will thank me for this one day." Lindsay mounted her horse and raced back to the ranch, bursting into the house where her father was finishing his breakfast. "They've taken Tyee," she gasped, words tumbling out as she explained what had happened. William's face grew grave as he listened. "Robbery charges are serious," he said when she finished. "But if he's been here the whole time, we can provide testimony to that effect." "It's a lie," Lindsay insisted. "Hank orchestrated this because—" she faltered. "Because he saw something between you and Tyee?" William finished gently. Lindsay nodded, tears threatening. "Father, please, you must help him." William rose from the table, reaching for his hat and coat. "I'll ride to town immediately. If this is about establishing Tyee's whereabouts, I can confirm he's been working here continuously." He paused, studying his daughter's distressed face. Lindsay, I need to know exactly what Hank saw between you two. She met her father's gaze, chin raised slightly. He saw us kiss, she admitted. It had just happened for the first time when they arrived. William closed his eyes briefly. That complicates matters. Hank will spread word, and accusations of impropriety with a white woman will be far more dangerous for Tyee than any robbery charge. But that's not fair, Lindsay protested. What business is it of anyone's who I choose to— This isn't about fairness, William interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. This is about the world we live in. I'll do what I can for Tyee because he's an innocent man and a valued employee. But Lindsay, he took her hands in his, you must prepare yourself. Even if I can secure his release, he cannot return here. The weight of her father's words struck Lindsay like a physical blow. Because of me, she whispered. Because once such talk begins, it never truly ends, William replied, for his safety as much as your reputation. William departed immediately for the territorial outpost where Tyee would have been taken. Lindsay spent the day in a state of tense anxiety, alternating between pacing and trying to distract herself with household tasks that she could barely focus on completing. Evening fell with no word from her father. Lindsay sat by the window in the parlor, watching the road, jumping at every sound. When she finally heard hoofbeats approaching, she rushed to the door, only to find Hank dismounting from his horse. "Where is my father?" she demanded, standing rigidly in the doorway. "Still in town?" Hank replied, removing his hat. "He sent me back to tell you he'll return tomorrow." The old cowhand's eyes held a mixture of triumph and what might have been regret. "The Apache is being held for trial." "On what charges?" Lindsay's voice was tight with controlled fury. "The robbery accusation is demonstrably false." Hank looked away. "Charges changed. Now they're saying inappropriate relations with a white woman. That's not a crime." "It is for an Indian," Hank replied simply. "Especially an Apache with all the bad blood still between them and settlers." He stepped closer. "Miss Lindsay, I've known you since you were a child. I did this for your own good." "That savage? Don't you dare call him that." Lindsay cut him off, her voice deadly quiet. "Tyee has more honor and decency than any man I've met in this territory, yourself included. Get off this property, Hank. You no longer work here." "That ain't your decision to make," Hank protested. "My father left me in charge in his absence," Lindsay replied. "Collect your things and be gone before morning." She closed the door in his face, then leaned against it as tears finally overwhelmed her. The enormity of what was happening, and her role in bringing it about, crashed over her in waves of guilt and fear. William returned late the next afternoon, his face lined with exhaustion and worry. Lindsay met him at the door, searching his expression for news. "I couldn't secure his release," William said without preamble as he removed his coat. "The territorial judge arrives next week. Tyee will remain in custody until then." "And the charges?" Lindsay asked, her voice small. William sighed heavily. "Officially, they're holding him on suspicion of involvement with renegade Apaches who've been raiding isolated homesteads." He looked directly at his daughter. "Unofficially, it's about you. Hank's story has spread. The settler community is inflamed by the idea of an Apache becoming involved with a white woman." "It was one kiss," Lindsay whispered. "Just one moment of truth after months of denying what we felt." "I believe you," William said gently. "But that hardly matters now. What will happen to him?" William hesitated. "The territorial judge is fair-minded from what I hear. If it were truly just about the false robbery accusation or these fabricated connections to raiders, I believe Tyee would be released, but with the personal aspect involved—" He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. "What, father?" Lindsay pressed. "The judge has the power to send him to a reservation, perhaps even one in another territory entirely, if he deems it necessary for public safety or moral concerns." Lindsay's hand flew to her mouth. "They would exile him based on a kiss." "Based on the fear of what that kiss represents," William corrected sadly. "Change comes slowly to places like this, Lindsay. Too slowly for those caught in its grinding wheels." "I need to see him," Lindsay declared. "I need to explain that I never meant for this to happen." William shook his head firmly. "That's impossible. They won't allow it, and attempting to visit would only make his situation worse." He took his daughter's shoulders gently. "Lindsay, listen to me. The best thing you can do for Tyee now is to publicly distance yourself from him. You're asking me to deny him? To deny what I feel? I'm asking you to save his life, William replied gravely, because that's what's at stake here. The week before the judge's arrival passed in excruciating slowness. Lindsay moved through her days like a ghost, performing her duties mechanically while her thoughts remained with Tyee in his cell. She wrote several letters to him, pouring out her heart on paper, but had no means to deliver them. William, true to his word, fired Hank permanently despite the old hand's protests and the inconvenience of losing an experienced worker. He rode to town daily, using his influence to ensure Tyee was treated humanely while in custody, and gathering what information he could about the legal proceedings to come. The evening before the judge was due to arrive, William returned from town with an unexpected visitor, Thomas Preston. Lindsay greeted him with cold politeness, having neither the energy nor inclination for social niceties. Mr. Preston has been kind enough to offer his legal assistance, William explained as they sat in the parlor. As a newly qualified attorney, he has studied the most recent territorial statutes. Thomas leaned forward, his manner professional despite the lingering admiration in his eyes when he looked at Lindsay. Miss Jameson, I understand your concern for your father's employee. While I don't personally approve of fraternization between races, I recognize that false accusations are a matter of justice, not personal sentiment. Lindsay bit back a sharp retort, reminding herself that Thomas's help might be Tyee's best chance. What can be done? She asked simply. The charges connecting him to renegade Apache raids are flimsy at best, Thomas explained. Your father's testimony about Tyee's continuous presence on the ranch should dispose of those easily enough. And the other matter? William asked when Thomas hesitated. Thomas cleared his throat, glancing uncomfortably at Lindsay. That's more complicated. While there's no specific territorial statute forbidding relations between Indians and whites, there are public morality laws that judges have wide latitude to interpret. He straightened in his chair. However, if the incident was a single occurrence, possibly initiated by the Indian rather than Miss Jameson, and if she were to make a statement distancing herself from any improper feelings. You want me to claim he forced his attentions on me? Lindsay interrupted, aghast. No, Thomas backpedaled quickly. Simply to state that while you were perhaps flattered by his admiration, you never encouraged or reciprocated such feelings. That the incident Hank witnessed was unwelcome and will not be repeated. Lindsay stood abruptly. I will not lie, she declared. Tyee is the most honorable man I've ever known. What happened between us was mutual and born of genuine feeling. Lindsay, her father began, his tone pleading. No, father. She turned to Thomas. I appreciate your willingness to help, Mr. Preston, but not at the cost of Tyee's dignity or my integrity. Thomas rose as well, his expression hardening. Miss Jameson, you don't seem to understand the gravity of the situation. The territorial authorities take a dim view of Apache men who overstep their place, especially with respectable white women. Without some statement from you mitigating his actions, your friend faces severe consequences. What consequences precisely? Lindsay demanded. Thomas hesitated, looking to William, who nodded grimly. At minimum, permanent removal to a distant reservation, Thomas said quietly. At worst, there have been cases where local sentiment ran so high that legal proceedings were circumvented. The implication hung in the air like poison. Lindsay sank back into her chair, suddenly understanding her father's desperate concern. They would lynch him, she whispered. For a kiss. For daring to reach above his station, Thomas corrected, though he had the grace to look uncomfortable with his own words. William crossed to kneel before his daughter's chair. Lindsay, I know what I'm asking goes against everything you believe in, but sometimes we must choose between terrible options. Lindsay looked from her father to Thomas, then closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, her decision was made. Very well, she said quietly. I will make a statement, but I will not claim his actions were unwelcome or inappropriate. I will simply say that I recognize such a relationship is impossible, and that I have no intention of pursuing it further. Thomas nodded. That should be sufficient, especially with your father's influence supporting it. After Thomas departed, Lindsay sat alone in her room, staring at the wooden horse Tyee had carved for her all those months ago. The elegant lines had captured the essence of freedom, something she now understood neither of them truly possessed in a world bound by invisible chains of prejudice and fear. The territorial judge arrived the following day, setting up court in the town's largest building, a combination of meeting hall and church. The entire settlement turned out for the proceedings, drawn by the sensational nature of the case and the rare opportunity for entertainment that a trial provided. Lindsay and William arrived early, dressed in their finest clothes to emphasize their standing in the community. Thomas Preston met them outside, reviewing last-minute details of their strategy. "Remember," he instructed Lindsay in a low voice, "express regret for any misunderstanding, but maintain that while you hold no ill will toward the Apache, you recognize the impossibility of any relationship beyond employer and employee." Lindsay nodded mechanically, her eyes fixed on the doorway through which Tyee would soon appear. When he was finally led in, her heart clenched painfully. Though he walked with his characteristic dignity, the week in custody had left visible marks, a gauntness to his face, shadows under his eyes, a fresh bruise along his jaw that spoke of mistreatment despite William's efforts. His eyes found hers immediately across the crowded room. Lindsay had to grip the bench beneath her to keep from rushing to him. His gaze held no accusation, only a deep sadness and something that looked remarkably like concern. For her, she realized, with a fresh wave of guilt. The proceedings began with formality, but quickly revealed their predetermined nature. The judge, though not overtly hostile, showed little interest in examining the evidence carefully. The robbery charges were dismissed perfunctorily based on William's testimony, but the more serious accusations of fomenting unrest among local Apaches and of improper conduct with a white woman were presented with damning emphasis by the territorial prosecutor. Hank testified with embellished details of what he'd witnessed at the creek, painting a picture of predatory behavior rather than the mutual tenderness that had actually occurred. Several townspeople offered hearsay about Tyee's supposed connections to Apache bands, still resisting reservation life, despite having never met him personally. Throughout it all, Tyee remained silent, declining to testify in his own defense on Thomas's advice. His stillness was not resignation, but a controlled dignity that made the proceedings seem all the more farcical by contrast. When Lindsay was finally called to speak, she rose on unsteady legs. The packed room fell silent, every eye upon her as she took her place before the judge. She had rehearsed her statement carefully with Thomas, constructed to protect Tyee while sacrificing the truth of her feelings. But standing there, seeing Tyee's quiet strength in the face of such injustice, the carefully prepared words dissolved in her throat. "Miss Jameson," the judge prompted, "please describe the nature of your interactions with the defendant." Lindsay took a deep breath. "Tyee came to our ranch seeking honest work, which he performed with exceptional skill and integrity. Over time, as we worked together, I came to respect his intelligence, his honor, and his kindness." Her voice grew stronger as she continued, ignoring Thomas's increasingly alarmed expression. "As for the incident Mr. Hank witnessed, it was not forced or unwelcome. It was a mutual expression of genuine feeling between two people who had grown to care deeply for one another." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Miss Jameson, are you stating under oath that you willingly engaged in intimate relations with this Apache?" "I am stating that Tyee and I shared one kiss," Lindsay replied steadily. "A kiss born of mutual respect and affection, not the lurid scenario that has been presented here." The judge's expression hardened. "Young woman, perhaps you don't understand the implications of what you're saying." "I understand perfectly, Your Honor," Lindsay replied. "I understand that a man is being condemned not for any crime, but for daring to care for someone whom society has deemed forbidden to him. I understand that I am expected to deny my own heart to satisfy the prejudices of others." "Lindsay," William's voice came from behind her, a desperate whisper. She turned slightly, meeting her father's anguished gaze with apologetic determination, then looked back to the judge. "If caring for someone regardless of their race or background is a crime in this territory, then perhaps your laws need reconsideration, Your Honor." The courtroom erupted in shocked exclamations. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly for order, his face flushed with anger or embarrassment. Lindsay couldn't tell which. When quiet was finally restored, he glared down at her. "Miss Jameson, you will be seated. The court will take a brief recess to consider this unexpected testimony." As Lindsay returned to her seat, she caught Tyee's gaze. His eyes held a mixture of pride, love, and devastating sadness. He gave her the slightest shake of his head, not in disapproval, she realized, but in recognition of what her truth-telling would cost them both. The recess lasted nearly an hour. When the judge returned, his expression was grave but composed. He surveyed the packed courtroom before speaking. Having considered all testimony and evidence, this court finds insufficient cause to hold the defendant on charges of robbery or insurrection. He paused, his gaze shifting to where Tyee stood, flanked by deputies. However, the defendant's own silence, combined with the testimony of Miss Jameson, creates a concerning picture of inappropriate relations that threaten the moral fabric and peaceful coexistence of this community. Lindsay felt her heart sinking as the judge continued. Therefore, while no criminal charges shall be filed, this court orders the defendant, Tyee of the Chiricahua Apache, to be removed from this district immediately and permanently relocated to the San Carlos Reservation. He is henceforth forbidden from entering any settlement in this territory without official escort and permission. The judge banged his gavel. Court is adjourned. The courtroom once again filled with voices, some triumphant, others merely gossiping about the scandal. Lindsay sat frozen, the magnitude of what had happened, what she had caused, washing over her in waves. "I need to speak to him," she whispered to her father. "Please." William, his face drawn with concern, hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Wait here." He rose and made his way to Thomas Preston, engaged in a hushed conversation that ended with Thomas approaching the judge. After several minutes of discussion, Thomas returned. "The judge will permit a brief farewell, supervised, before the deputies transport him," Thomas said, his voice clipped with disapproval. "It's more than he should allow, given the circumstances." Lindsay followed a deputy to a small antechamber where Tyee waited, his wrists bound, another deputy standing guard by the door. "5 minutes," the deputy instructed gruffly, "and keep your distance." When the door closed, leaving them with only the silent deputy as witness, Lindsay finally allowed her tears to fall. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "This is all my fault." "No," Tyee replied, his voice steady, despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "You spoke truth in a place built on lies. Never apologize for that. But now they're sending you away. Because of me. Because I couldn't hide what I felt. They are sending me away because they fear what we represent," Tyee corrected gently. "The possibility that their boundaries and divisions might not be as immutable as they believe." Lindsay moved forward instinctively, stopping when the deputy cleared his throat in warning. "What will happen to you on the reservation?" she asked, desperate to memorize every line of Tyee's face in these final moments. A shadow crossed his expression. "The reservation is not a good place, but I have survived worse. I'll find a way to come to you," Lindsay promised impulsively. "Once this has died down—" "No," Tyee interrupted, his voice suddenly fierce. "You must not. The reservation is no place for you, and my people would not welcome you there." His expression softened. "Lindsay Jameson, you have given me something I never thought to find again after I lost my wife and child, the knowledge that love can still bloom in the harshest desert. But now you must let me go." "How?" she asked, her voice breaking. "How do I just continue as if none of this happened? As if you never came into my life?" Tyee's gaze held hers with unbearable tenderness. "You live. You find joy where you can. You remember that what we shared was real, even if the world wasn't ready for it." "Time's up," the deputy announced, moving toward the door. "Wait," Lindsay cried, reaching into her pocket to withdraw the wooden horse Tyee had carved for her. "I brought this for you to keep with you, to remember." "Keep it," Tyee said softly. "I need no token to remember you. You are written on my heart." He straightened, seeming to gather his strength. "Lindsay, listen carefully. Tonight, when the first star appears, I will make a promise to you under its light. Every night after, when you see that star, know that I am looking at it too, repeating that same promise." "What promise?" she asked, as the deputy opened the door to admit 2 more guards. Tyee smiled, a rare, full smile that transformed his solemn features. "That love endures, that borders and barriers created by men cannot contain it, that someday the world will change and what we found together will no longer need to hide in shadows." The deputies moved forward to take Tyee away. Lindsay stepped back, her hand clutching the wooden horse as if it were a lifeline. "I will look for the star," she promised, her voice steady despite her tears. "Every night." Tyee nodded once, then turned to go with the deputies, his back straight and his head held high. That evening, Lindsay stood on the porch of the ranch house, her eyes fixed on the darkening sky. Her father had maintained a respectful distance throughout the day, understanding her need for solitude. The ranch hands, hearing of the trial's outcome, had given the house a wide berth, uncertain how to interact with the woman who had defied convention so boldly. As the first star appeared in the deepening blue, Lindsay whispered Tyee's name. Miles away, she knew he would be looking at that same star, speaking his promise to the night. Though she couldn't hear his words, she felt them resonate within her, a testament to a love that had flowered briefly but truly, a beacon of possibility in a world still learning to overcome its divisions. The wooden horse sat on the railing beside her, its carved lines catching the last light of day. Lindsay ran her fingers over it, feeling the smoothness of the wood under her touch, just as she had felt the strength of Tyee's spirit, unbroken despite the hardships he had endured. "I will remember," she whispered to the star above, "and I will live in a way that honors what we found together." She didn't know what the future held, whether Tyee would find a way to send word to her, whether the world would indeed change as he had predicted, whether their paths might someday cross again. But in that moment, under the same star that witnessed his promise, Lindsay made one of her own, to carry the truth of their love forward, to let it guide her choices and strengthen her resolve, to be worthy of the man who had shown her that the most beautiful things often grow in the most unlikely places. And in that promise, she found a measure of peace. 5 years had passed since Tyee was sent to the San Carlos reservation. 5 years of Lindsay looking to the stars each night, remembering his promise. 5 years of her refusing numerous suitors, much to the disappointment of her father, who eventually stopped introducing her to suitable young men. The Arizona territory had changed in those years. The railroad had expanded, bringing more settlers but also new ideas. William Jameson's ranch had prospered, and he had become an influential voice in territorial politics, advocating for fair treatment of all people, regardless of their origins, a change of heart inspired by witnessing his daughter's unwavering devotion to her principles. Lindsay had changed too. No longer the sheltered young woman who had returned from Boston, she now managed much of the ranch's business affairs, earning respect from merchants and cattlemen alike. But beneath her composed exterior, the memory of Tyee remained as vivid as the day he was taken away. On a warm September evening in 1883, Lindsay sat on the porch reviewing the ranch's ledgers as the sun began its descent behind the distant mountains. A rider appeared on the horizon, following the main road toward the ranch house. Something about the figure's silhouette against the setting sun caused her heart to quicken. She set aside her papers and stood, shading her eyes against the golden light. The rider sat tall in the saddle, with a distinctive grace that had once been as familiar to her as her own reflection. "It can't be," she whispered, her hands gripping the porch railing. But as the rider drew closer, there was no mistaking him. Tyee, older, with streaks of silver in his long black hair, but unmistakably him. His face was leaner, marked by new lines of hardship, but his eyes, those dark, soulful eyes, remained unchanged. Lindsay descended the porch steps slowly, afraid that if she moved too quickly, this vision would vanish like morning mist. Tyee dismounted, standing beside his horse, watching her approach with an expression of mingled hope and uncertainty. "You came back," Lindsay said, when she finally stood before him, her voice barely above a whisper. "I promised under the stars," Tyee replied simply. Her composure broke then. 5 years of longing and restraint dissolved as she threw herself into his arms. Tyee held her tightly, his face buried in her hair, his body solid and real against hers. "How is this possible?" she asked when they finally drew apart, though she kept hold of his hands, unwilling to break contact. "The court order is no longer in effect," came her father's voice from behind them. Lindsay turned to find William standing on the porch, watching them with a complex expression that melded residual concern with genuine happiness. "Father?" Lindsay questioned, confused, but not releasing Tyee's hands. William descended the steps, approaching them with measured strides. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation inside," he suggested, gesturing toward the house. "There's much to discuss." In the parlor, with the golden light of sunset streaming through the windows, William explained, "I've spent the past 3 years petitioning the territorial governor and working through legal channels to have Tyee's restriction order overturned." He looked at Tyee with newfound respect. "It was finally granted last month. I sent word to San Carlos immediately." Lindsay looked between her father and Tyee in astonishment. "You did this? Without telling me?" "I couldn't bear to give you hope that might come to nothing," William replied. "The legal process was complicated and uncertain." "I received your father's message 3 weeks ago," Tyee added. "It took time to arrange my release from the reservation." Lindsay turned to her father, emotion welling in her throat. "Why? After everything you said about the impossibility of us being together..." William sighed, running a hand through hair that had grown considerably more grey in the past 5 years. "Because I was wrong," he admitted simply. "Wrong to believe that the boundaries society creates should dictate where love can grow." He looked at his daughter with tender pride. "And because in 5 years, despite numerous eligible suitors, your heart remained constant. Such devotion deserves honor, not opposition." Tears filled Lindsay's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. William turned to Tyee. "You should know that things have changed here. I've made sure of it. Most of the old hands who knew you are gone. The new ones have been chosen for their character, not their prejudices." He straightened, his expression becoming more formal. "And I've prepared legal documents, land grants in Lindsay's name, with provisions that protect your joint interests, should you choose to build a life together." Tyee's stoic expression softened with surprise. "You would bless such a union?" "I would bless my daughter's happiness," William replied, "and I've come to believe that lies with you." He extended his hand to Tyee. "If you still wish it to be so." Tyee clasped William's hand firmly. "I have never wished for anything else." That night, beneath the same stars that had witnessed their separation 5 years before, Tyee and Lindsay walked along the creek where they had shared their first kiss. The air was sweet with the scent of late summer blossoms, the water reflecting the moon's silver light. "When I was on the reservation," Tyee said as they stopped beside a large cottonwood tree, "there were days of great darkness, hunger, disease, the crushing of spirit that comes from being caged." He turned to Lindsay, taking her hands in his. "But each night, I would find our star, and I would make my promise anew. That love endures. That one day, I would find my way back to you." "And I heard you," Lindsay replied softly. "Across all the distance, I felt your promise keeping our connection alive." Tyee reached into a small pouch at his waist, the same one he had carried when he first arrived at the ranch all those years ago. From it, he withdrew something that gleamed in the moonlight, a silver ring adorned with a turquoise stone. "This belonged to my grandmother," he explained. "It is one of the few possessions I was able to keep when my people were moved to the reservation." He held it between them, the moonlight catching on its surface. "Among my people, such a gift symbolizes not ownership, but partnership. 2 spirits choosing to walk the same path, supporting each other through all seasons." Lindsay's breath caught as she understood what he was offering. "Tyee, Lindsay Jameson," he said, his voice deep with emotion, "will you walk this path with me? Not as what the world expects us to be, but as what we know we are. 2 souls who have found their match despite all that stood between them." "Yes," she answered without hesitation, joy radiating from her like physical warmth. "Today and all days to come." Tyee slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into an embrace that sealed their commitment beneath the witness of stars. 2 months later, on a perfect autumn day, a small gathering assembled behind the Jameson ranch house. A wooden arch had been constructed, decorated with wildflowers and native grasses. Beneath it stood Tyee, dressed in a formal suit that honored Western tradition, while a single eagle feather in his hair acknowledged his heritage. William Jameson stood proudly at his side, having insisted on serving as Tyee's best man, a public declaration of his support that had sent ripples of surprise and respect throughout the territory. The ranch hands, all carefully selected by William for their character, rather than their prejudices, stood in a respectful semicircle, along with a few friends who had proven their loyalty and open-mindedness. Among them was Thomas Preston, who had eventually come to recognize that true justice sometimes required challenging established norms. When Lindsay appeared, escorted by Catherine Preston, who had become her dear friend after recognizing the depth of Lindsay's commitment to Tyee, a hushed murmur of appreciation spread through the gathering. She wore a simple white dress adorned with beadwork that Tyee had taught her to create, blending her world with his in visible symbolism. The ceremony combined elements from both cultures, a territorial judge officiating to ensure legal recognition, while Tyee incorporated Apache blessings that honored the sacred nature of their commitment. As they exchanged vows, Lindsay glanced at her father, whose eyes shone with tears of joy rather than the concern that had once shadowed them. That evening, a celebration unlike any the territory had seen brought together people who might never otherwise have shared a meal. Music from both cultures filled the air as the ranch house glowed with lantern light. William had spared no expense, determined that his daughter's wedding would be remembered not as a scandal, but as the beginning of a new understanding. As night fell, Tyee led Lindsay away from the festivities to a quiet spot where they could see the stars emerging in the darkening sky. "Look," he said, pointing to the first bright star that appeared, the same one that had witnessed their promise years before. "Our star." Lindsay leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "We don't need to make promises tonight," she said softly. "We've already kept the ones that matter." Tyee turned to her, framing her face with gentle hands. "One more," he suggested. "A promise to remember that what seemed impossible became possible because we refused to stop believing in it." "I promise," Lindsay whispered, rising on tiptoes to seal the vow with a kiss. As they returned to their celebration, William met them at the edge of the gathering, his expression serene. "I have something for you both," he said, extending an envelope. Inside was a deed to the eastern portion of the Jameson ranch, 200 acres of prime land with access to the creek, and a small cabin William had built over the previous months. "Your home," he explained, "close enough for family, far enough for privacy." His eyes twinkled with unexpected mischief. "And room enough for grandchildren when the time comes." Lindsay embraced her father tightly. "Thank you for changing," she whispered, "for seeing beyond what you were taught to believe." "Thank you for showing me how," William replied, his voice rough with emotion. Later that night, as Lindsay and Tyee stood on the porch of their new cabin, the sounds of the celebration still faintly audible in the distance, they looked out at the land that would be their future, land where their children would grow up knowing both cultures, where the boundaries that had once seemed impenetrable had dissolved in the face of love's persistent truth. "The Apache gave himself up to protect her name," Tyee murmured, echoing the words that had spread through the territory years before. "And left her with a promise under the stars," Lindsay finished, linking her fingers with his. "A promise we kept." Above them, the night sky spread out in endless possibility, just as their future now opened before them, hard-won, precious, and entirely their own. In a world where negative news often dominates our attention, the Apache who gave himself up to protect her name reminds us of a timeless truth. Goodness still exists abundantly around us, even if it's not always what makes the headlines. Just like Lindsay's family, who initially resisted but eventually not only accepted Tyee but embraced him as an integral part of their family, there are countless people today who choose love over prejudice, understanding over division. These stories rarely go viral, but they happen every day in our communities. William's transformation from a man bound by societal expectations to one who championed his daughter's happiness, regardless of convention, shows us that hearts and minds can change. Even today, people are quietly building bridges across the divides that society creates, recognizing that our common humanity matters more than our differences. The truth is that for every story of hatred or division that captures our attention, there are thousands of untold stories of kindness, acceptance, and love. Families who open their homes to those different from themselves. Communities that rally around neighbors in need regardless of background. Individuals who choose to see with eyes that truly see beyond surface differences. If we train ourselves to look for the good, to notice the small acts of compassion and the quiet bridges being built, we discover that love and positivity continue to thrive in our world. The media may not amplify these stories, but they are the true foundation of our shared human experience. So perhaps the most valuable lesson we can take from Tyee and Lindsay's journey is to be deliberate about where we place our attention, to seek out and celebrate goodness where we find it, to be courageous enough to create it where it's needed, and to remember that even in the face of seemingly impossible odds, love has a persistent way of finding a path forward. So we invite you, dear listener, pay more attention to the good, to the neighbor who smiles, the stranger who helps, the soul who dares to love beyond boundaries, because love still lives, goodness still grows, and light still rises, even in the darkest deserts. From Wild West Whispers, we thank you for walking this trail of hope with us. May your spirit be carried by the winds of possibility, your heart warmed by the fire of compassion, and may you feel embraced by the strength of 1,000 suns. Until our paths cross again beneath the storytelling stars, thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. If it touched your heart, we kindly invite you to subscribe, leave a comment, like, and share this video with others. Your support truly means the world to us and keeps our passion alive to tell more stories filled with love, healing, and hope. And don't go just yet. Another beautiful story from our channel will appear right after this one. Click and discover a new emotional journey that may surprise you, just like this one did.